Wonderful. All right. Well, good to have all of our elected officials with us. And so I'm going to go right in before I get to my general report about the party and do this special report. So this is going to be me talking at you for 10 to 15 minutes. And I know that sometimes it's not the most engaging way to communicate information, but I feel like in this case, it was necessary because, and like I say, we're going to record this for folks who aren't here because I've gotten so many emails and phone calls over the past year with different ideas about the endorsements process that we as a party have. And so I feel like rather than having small conversations with different people, having a big explainer from the ground up for folks who may be new is the most accessible way to go. So I'll just jump right into it and say that some of our most valued and treasured accomplishments in recent years, I think, have been getting candidates who share our values elected to school boards and city councils and county commissions. And so this progress that we've made has been in part, at least, due to the way we've gone about our campaigning. And that's been endorsing candidates, placing them on our slate cards for distribution through our neighborhood leader program, and making financial resources available a lot of times, which in these local elections especially has a big impact. And the party sees a small number of elections each year with multiple registered Democrats running for the same position who are both highly qualified. And in those cases, the endorsements committee's recommendation is usually contested here at the central committee. So they'll come out with a recommendation, and then there'll be a debate and sometimes close votes. And questions sometimes come up about how it works, not just the rules of how it works that have been passed by central committees long gone many years ago and been amended through the years, and then also how it really works in practice. So I have about 20 short bullet points I want to get through how it works, and then 20 short bullet points of suggestions and questions that have been written in that I'm going to say these are what I'm going to be asking all of you in a survey and the other PCPs who couldn't be with us tonight to give your input on and whether changes are needed or whether things are going perfect the way they are. So, or the best possible. So on the current practices, our party does not endorse in partisan primary elections currently. That would be like for state legislature. The party lets the voters decide and then supports the nominee they choose in the general election. So all of us individually may volunteer with and support candidates in state legislative primaries or the primary for governor that's going to be coming up in the Democratic primary, but we as a party don't take any official position. What we do is endorse in elections with no partisan primary. So that usually means school boards, city councils, like I said, and county commissions. A big one that we're really interested in coming up in the next cycle is the district attorney, for example. And for some of those, because cities and counties can have home rule, they have their own charters, then it's not uniform across the different cities. But in many of those, there's just an election in November. And some of them, there's a nonpartisan primary in May, and then a runoff between the top two candidates in November. But those are the races we do endorse in. So our county is one of a small number in what I've looked at across our state that does endorse in these nonpartisan elections, pick one Democrat and promote them. The practice is more common in some other states, but less common here in Oregon. It started, from what I can tell from talking with folks who have been around the party for many years and decades in some cases, when the county was struggling with many conservative local leaders, and it was felt that the party should get behind one Democrat so that the progressive vote was not split between multiple Democrats. And it's inarguable that there certainly has been success in turning the county blue. I'm sure some of that was demographic and just would have happened regardless of what the party did. But I think those of us who've spent time and energy on our neighborhood leader program would like to believe that we contributed to the fact that the county has progressive leaders in many cases in local offices now. So when there are multiple Democrats, the tradition in our county has been to just endorse one of them, and not shared or split endorsements like they do in many other counties. Shared endorsements are technically allowed under the current rules, but they're almost never recommended. It's sort of a widespread view among party members who are highly involved that even when two candidates seem highly qualified, the committee should recommend just one of them. And so how it works is currently the party chair appoints a 5-member endorsement committee, and that committee sends out questionnaires to candidates who apply for endorsements, and then the committee interviews them using the information in those questionnaires. The current rules don't allow any officer or board member of the party to serve on the committee. So that limits the number of people who are able to serve on the endorsement committee. And under our current rules, only registered Democrats are eligible to apply for endorsement. If a person who has not been a Democrat for at least 6 months wants to be endorsed, the Central Committee has to vote to suspend that rule. So that's why on rare occasions when there's a conservative running against a progressive who has recently become a Democrat, sometimes you'll hear a request to suspend the rules, because currently you have to have been a Democrat for 6 months to ordinarily apply for endorsement. The endorsement committee recommends who they think should be endorsed based on the questionnaire and their interviews to the Central Committee, to all of you who are precinct leaders. And the Central Committee most often votes to ratify those recommendations, but has on a few occasions over the past several years voted otherwise, to go differently than the recommendation of the committee. I've noticed that endorsement meetings of the Central Committee are often the most highly attended of the year. When multiple Democrats are competing for the endorsement, in a good way, each one wants to get their supporters, people who believe in their causes and that they're the best person for the job, to who are PCPs, to attend the meeting and vote for them in that contested endorsement vote. So the committee has not recently been in the practice of providing a copy of candidates' questionnaire answers to the full Central Committee membership before the Central Committee meeting. They have also not recently been in the practice of providing a detailed written rationale with a list of their recommendations and why for the full membership to study in advance of the meeting. Instead, what the committee has done is announce their recommendations at the meeting itself of the Central Committee. And so there's nothing in the rules specifically on that point, but that's been their recent practice. And I'm trying to describe this just as it is, rather than make editorial comments at this point. So at the Central Committee, each candidate, as you all have mostly lived through, but for those who may be new and watching this video later on, each candidate in the contested position is invited to speak briefly, oftentimes for just a moment or two. And then the endorsement committee chair announces what the committee is recommending based on their interviews and questionnaires. And then the full membership debates the recommendation with the candidates present, as they would for any motion before the Central Committee, like a resolution or a rules change. And obviously that's a tense and potentially uncomfortable debate because the candidates are present and they're hearing their pros and cons being openly discussed in a large group. So I think that's sort of a reality. In political parties and trade unions where the full membership ratifies endorsement decisions, it's common for these votes to be difficult and sometimes even contentious, and no policy is likely to fully change that because each candidate's fiercely seeking after the party endorsement, and they often have many passionate supporters, including other elected officials. And so it's never going to be a very simple, easy thing. There are always going to be emotions involved. But of course, we want to make it the most professional experience possible and get the best candidates endorsed. So our endorsed candidates get significant benefits. As I mentioned, they appear on our slate cards. They are featured prominently in our social media, and sometimes we do paid social media advertising for them and support them in other ways. So by way of comparison, Multnomah and Clackamas County parties, Democratic parties, do not endorse in races where there are multiple Democrats. They just list them all on the primary slate card and say, here are all the Democrats. Lane County, another large Democratic county, does endorse, but they don't have a committee that pre-vets the candidates in advance. Rather, they just have candidates fill out a questionnaire and then give that to the Central Committee members and have them speak at the Central Committee meeting. And so there's not the same level of advance vetting, and there's not a recommendation. It's just up to the Central Committee to make a motion. So now timing is another question that I've got a lot. And so to explain that, in recent years, candidates have indicated the importance of placing party endorsement in the voter pamphlet statement. So the way the deadlines work, sometimes the deadline when filing closes is just 2, 3, 4 days before the deadline when candidates have to submit their statement for the voters pamphlet, which means that to do interviews and recommendations over the course of a number of weeks and then bring that to a central committee meeting, the endorsement committee often has to have a deadline well in advance of the close of filing for people to apply for endorsement. That means that if a candidate files late in the season, close to the deadline, the party may already have endorsed a different candidate. Now, some members have told me in email and phone calls that they view that as not an issue, that they say, well, well-prepared, well-organized candidates who have been getting ready to run for a significant period of time and who are not at the last minute, they're the ones who are the most likely to win. They're who we want to endorse anyway. But other members feel like the party should work to include candidates who file closer to the deadline in some way because they bring important perspectives. And it may be that those who file late or closer to the deadline come from disproportionately underrepresented communities, bring perspectives that haven't been heard because they haven't been a part of the circle of people who know about politics. So that those folks, so there's different perspectives on that question. But that's why that comes up, is because of folks want to put it in the voter pamphlet. Well, then the process has to start well in advance of that. A new party chair is elected in even numbered years in late November, as you all know. And sometimes I found, when I was first elected a few years ago, there's a lot of pressing matters you have to get straightened out and different folks you need to recruit to take leadership roles. And so it can be difficult to recruit endorsement committee members during the holiday season. So they may not really get appointed and have everything getting ready to go until the middle of January for May elections. And that's a very tight timeline to establish deadlines, decide on how the committee wants to go about its internal processes, especially if there's new endorsement committee members. So they're on an incredibly compressed timeline. And the work of the endorsement committee, when done seriously and earnestly, in my opinion, takes a substantial amount of time. So it can take some time to find members who are not already volunteering for the party and other leadership roles, but who are willing to really do a full and complete job and put in that time. So it's not easy to find people in all cases. And I believe that the endorsement committee, I think all of you will believe that the endorsement committee needs to have diversity of views and backgrounds, including all the forms of diversity that we as a party champion. But with a limited amount of volunteers, it hasn't always been possible to satisfy that goal. So that's another thing we'd like your input on how we can do better. And as with any volunteer position, more onerous requirements, more weighty requirements will likely result in fewer people willing to serve. So you have to find a balance between having expectations and wanting them to do a complete job, but at the same time not making it so overwhelming that no one wants to volunteer. So the two last things on this facts, the summary of the current situation. The endorsement committee typically informs candidates of the opportunity to request endorsements. So they'll look, in February or January, whenever before the May election, for instance, and look at who's filed and try to reach out to the folks who have filed. However, there are so many smaller districts throughout the county and filing happens over many months. So it's possible that some candidates might slip through the cracks and not be contacted, and they would need to contact us. So the committee tries to be proactive, but it's possible that some candidates may not be contacted. And in a case with two candidates, it's just common logic that if there's a very close vote, because there's two Democrats and the Central Committee votes for one over the other and very narrowly, that means that half of us, the active members, are backing the other candidate. And sometimes people have written in and say they have mixed feelings about distributing the party's materials because of those, if that's the case. And so the question is, as I'll talk about in a moment, some folks have said, well, should it require more than a simple majority to endorse so that its endorsements are done when there's some greater degree of consensus? But certainly there are mixed feelings on that as well. So that's endorsements. Now, a few comments briefly on the contributions side of things. So on the contributions side of things, our current party rules and bylaws provide that legislative candidate campaigns, we don't do endorsements in those, but we can contribute to those even before the primary if we're targeting a Republican held seat and we want to make sure that folks get some publicity, get some seed funds. I think it was Emily's list that used to say early contributions, are pretty impactful. So it's the practice of the party to contribute to all legislative candidates in a given primaries equally if that's done. and then despite it not being mentioned in the bylaws section on contribution, the party has also historically, and this may be what we're all more familiar with, contributed to endorsed candidates in local nonpartisan elections. So in recent years, recommendations for endorsed candidates are often proposed at the Central Committee meeting the month after they were endorsed, but they could be brought forward by the Endorsements Committee the same month. So they could say, vote on whether to endorse these folks. And then here's our recommendation for the amount of funds we think within the budget that's set by the Central Committee for endorsements broadly. Here's how much we think each race should get. And they use a wide variety of factors to consider how much contributions to recommend. There's been debate on whether unopposed candidates for these local races should receive contributions. Some members feel that giving from the party treasury builds support and may prevent opponents from filing when they see that this candidate we support has been given some donations from us, and it builds a relationship between that candidate and the party. Other members feel that money should really be best spent targeting the hotly contested races. So there's a variety of viewpoints you've all shared with me on that. The Endorsements Committee is required by our current rules to mail contribution request forms to all eligible candidates with an explanation and timeline of the contribution process, but this has not always been done. I think likely due to the limited time of volunteer committee members who may not always get around to doing that. So I think, again, it's a balance between what we expect, how much time we expect, and versus sometimes, because the committee is all volunteers, candidates may need to be proactive in reaching out if somehow something slips between the cracks. But with regard to contribution, the Endorsements Committee is required to provide a written report on each candidate in our current bylaws, including a description of responses to the questions and the reason they're recommending a certain contribution amount. And what the rules say about that you all passed, or the previous Central Committee passed, about what they should look at in considering contributions are experience, ability, integrity, views on positions contained in the county platform, and participation in party activities. Now, that written report has not always been extensive, again, I think due to the limited time of the committee members who are volunteers. So that's the current state of affairs. And then I'm going to take a few more moments to go through the questions that you have all sent in as far as ideas. And these are the questions that I'm going to be asking all of you to, all of the PCPs to chime in on in a survey that'll go out in the next couple weeks. So the first one is very basic. And should the party continue endorsing in races where there are multiple Democrats? So for the city council race, if there's two good Democrats, should we continue endorsing? The yes argument is that it prevents vote splitting, which could allow conservative to win, and it promotes our party values, getting people elected who are in line with what we believe in. The contrary argument that a few folks have sent in to me is that it would prevent hard feelings and party disunity, and we would have better relations with all the candidates if we did what other counties like Multnomah and Clackamas do. So that's the first fundamental question. Then the questions, assuming that the answer is yes, the questions about the process. Should the party require more than a majority, such as a 2/3 consensus, to endorse candidates? Is it the candidate's responsibility to reach out to the Endorsements Committee, or does the committee need to try to find every candidate? Should a committee continue to exist to make recommendations to the Central Committee, and should that committee continue to have 5 members? Instead of appointing a new committee for each election, should a committee be appointed for a longer term, such as ongoing or for 2 years? What criteria should the Endorsement Committee use? Should the party write a platform or action item list that's very specific to local offices that the committee could then use when evaluating candidates? What criteria should I, or whoever is serving as the party chair, use to select members of the Endorsements Committee? Should they represent the views of the Central Committee? Should they have a record of being visible and active in the party? Or would it be better to try to recruit some newly involved members who may bring new perspectives? Should the party request our endorsed candidates support one another? That's another question that some of you have asked over the past year. Should the Central Committee be informed of the Endorsements Committee recommendation before the meeting on which they will be voted? So posting, like we do with resolutions and rules, a written report about what's going to happen before it happens. Should the Endorsements Committee posts the candidate questionnaires and answers for study by Central Committee members. So some feel like that's could involve confidential campaign tactics or plans, and others say some portion of the questionnaire should be available for Central Committee members to ponder when they're deciding whether to accept the recommendations of the endorsement committee. Another is, should the endorsement committee release their recommendations and a detailed rationale in advance of the Central Committee meeting? So it's similar to what but we're looking at, should the questionnaire be released, and then should a written report be released? Then, timing-wise, should the committee continue to set a deadline in advance of the filing deadline, excluding candidates who file very close to the deadline, in order to allow the party endorsement to be entered into the voter pamphlet? So I'm going to talk about in a later question, there are some suggestions for making it so that the deadline can be closer, but given how close the filing deadline and the voter pamphlet deadline are, and the amount of work the committee has to do, it seems like if it's going to be guaranteed that folks can get our party's endorsement in the voter pamphlet statement that goes out in the mail to all the voters, they would have to have a deadline at least somewhat in advance of the close of filing. Because I think it's like May 18th and May 20th is next year, and they need some time to question and interview the candidates. And then in cases with multiple highly qualified Democrats running, should shared endorsements continue to be discouraged? Should we still have that tradition of telling the committee we want them to pick the best one, even if there's multiple qualified candidates? Are there any needed changes to the process for debating endorsement recommendations at Central Committee meetings? Some have said maybe the candidates should speak longer. Some have said, well, sometimes the debating in front of the candidates about their flaws and can be embarrassing and difficult. And it is unusual, but is there some better way while still saying, well, the Central Committee has to make a decision? And then another one that's gotten a lot of interest from a lot of you here tonight is, should a special meeting of the Central Committee be held to vote on endorsements separate from regular meetings, with the idea that it could be held closer to the deadline, and also it could give more time for candidates to speak at greater length and discussions to be done at greater length? So should there be a special meeting? The con argument, some have said, is that can we be sure the special meeting will be well attended? It won't be something people have on their calendars as far in advance as knowing that when the regular meeting is every month. Then there's a question, instead of voting at the Central Committee meeting, should we have a meeting where candidates talk about themselves and hear the recommendation of the committee, and then invite members to vote by electronic ballot over several days? That's another way that some of you have suggested. So that's a question that'll be in the survey. And then another question is, should party leaders, board members, and folks who are House district leaders, should they be encouraged to support the party's endorsed candidates? What if they have a strong feeling otherwise? Right now, we don't have any requirement that anyone in a leadership position, if they have personal conscience decisions otherwise, it has to go with what the party says. But what are your feelings on that? And then, are there any needed changes to the process for recommending and approving contributions to candidates from the party treasury? So you've been through the process of hearing, and sometimes people say, well, I don't understand why different amounts weren't used, or should we have had more time? So it's a very, chop process sometimes to get the money out to the folks who need it, but are there better ways to go about that? And then finally, as I mentioned, what should the committee's position be regarding contributions to unopposed candidates? Do we want to say, we want to give you some funds to get your name out in the community? Or do we want to say, if you're running unopposed, we think our money is better spent on the contested races? So I know that was a lot of just downloading information to you for 15 minutes there, but we're going to try and make this video available. Those are the facts of how we do it now, and the questions that all of you have written into me, I collected and compiled and sort of blended together. And so I'm going to send out a survey to all the PCPs, and hopefully you'll think about what I've mentioned today. And the survey will have a lot of those questions in one form or another, about not asking you about specific changes or language about rules, wordsmithing, but just as a broad conceptual level, what you think about those questions. Is this is this something you want to change, or is this something you like the way it goes now? And then I'll go out in the next couple of weeks. And then once that information is collected, our rules chair, Garrett Fleener, I'll work with him to set up a time when the rules committee will meet and look at that, and invite campaign and House district volunteers, anyone who wants to be involved here, and then start to talk about whether there's any basis to make any refinements or not. And the reason it's good to do this now is that we're not expecting any candidate races in November of this year. And so we have a window here before an endorsement committee needs to start their work up again in the winter for the May 2022 election, where if there are some refinements that the members here want to be made, we can do that process of getting them approved. So I know that some of you may not care as much about this, but for a lot of you, I can tell by how you're having written in and called that you do have ideas and suggestions. And so I wanted to lay that groundwork for this is how things are done. And then you'll be getting that survey. So if you have questions, this is a high level overview. I don't know if we want to go into great detail now because we have other things to discuss tonight. You can email me directly, but if you have something that's really pressing, you can raise your hand now and I'll try and answer it. Amelia?
My question is actually unrelated to this. We skipped our normal introductions of candidates, and I'm hoping you will go back to that briefly when you have a minute.
Oh, absolutely. Sure. Yes. We only have one candidate that I know of, and I was going to speak about that in a moment, but definitely in case there's others I don't know about, I will. So I don't see any other questions on this subject, but hopefully that was informative, and thank you for letting me